Workers who go into people's houses for their job. What is the strangest, creepiest thing you've ever seen or experienced? Story 1. When I was in college, I worked as a pizza delivery driver for a small local pizzeria in a very upscale area. It was a job that came with its fair share of weird and interesting experiences, but one particular incident stands out in my memory. It unfolded over a couple of weeks and left a lasting impression on me. It all started with a phone call. I was at the pizzeria, answering phones between deliveries, when a man called to place an order. He was slurring his words, and it was clear he was drunk. I took his order, thinking nothing of it, just another customer. A few days later, he called again, and once more, he was drunk. This time, I recognized his voice and the address. I didn't think much of it until a few days after that, when I came into work and saw a note posted by the phones. Do not take orders from address. Bad checks. Sure enough, the man called again, still drunk. When I told him we couldn't take his order because of the bad checks, he started begging, his voice cracking as if he were on the verge of tears. I felt a pang of sympathy. It's okay if you pay cash, I said. He promised he would. Another driver was sent with the pizza and strict instructions to only accept cash. About 20 minutes later, the driver called back. He doesn't have any cash, he said. He wants me to take him to an ATM. I told the driver to just come back. When he returned, he looked shaken. The guy's a mess, he said. He's wasted, and his place is full of empty bottles. We put the pizza on top of the oven, knowing we could eat it later if no one claimed it. The man called back, crying and begging for food. He said he hadn't eaten in days. Against my better judgment, I told him I'd bring him the pizza after my shift if no one else wanted it. A few hours later, the pizza was still there, so I decided to take it to him. When I arrived at his house, I knocked on the door. There was no answer at first, but I could hear movement inside. As I turned to leave, the door opened, and the man invited me in. I hesitated, wanting to just hand him the pizza and leave, but he insisted, saying he wanted to pay me. Inside, the house was a disaster. The kitchen was littered with empty vodka bottles. There must have been 100 of them. He poured himself another drink and grabbed his checkbook, offering me a drink as well. I declined. He apologized for how he'd answered the door, explaining that hookers had been coming over and stealing from him. As he started writing the check, we made small talk. I don't remember exactly how it came up, but I tried to gently suggest that he needed help, maybe rehab. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. He froze, looking terrified, and shushed me. It's probably a hooker coming back to steal more, he whispered. The door opened, and a woman walked in. I was on edge, thinking it might be a dangerous situation, but it turned out to be his wife. She was just as surprised to see me as I was to see her. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. I explained that I was just delivering pizza. Once the confusion was cleared up, she became more pleasant. She told me the man's story. He had fallen off the wagon, and she had left him, freezing his accounts to prevent him from spending all their money on alcohol and hookers. She wrote me a personal check for the pizza, including a generous tip. I cashed it later and split the tip with the other driver, each of us getting about $10. A few days later, I was back at work when my boss handed me a letter. It was from the man's wife, thanking me for my kindness and letting my boss know that my actions had convinced her husband to go back into rehab. I felt a sense of pride, but it was short-lived. My boss looked at me sternly. "What were you thinking?" he asked. "It's none of your business to get involved." And just like that, I was fired. Looking back, I'm still not entirely sure why I got fired. My boss was usually fair and open-minded, but I think he saw the situation as too risky. I had put another driver in a potentially dangerous position, and I had walked into a volatile situation on my own time. What I remember most clearly is my boss saying, "It was none of your business." In the end, I didn't do much to encourage the man to get help. I was in an uncomfortable situation with a drunk stranger, and I didn't want to provoke him. I think his estranged wife showing up when she did, with a neutral third party present, was probably more influential than anything I said. Still, I like to think that my small act of kindness played a part in his decision to seek help. The experience taught me a lot about the complexities of human behavior and the fine line between compassion and overstepping boundaries. It also reminded me that sometimes, The smallest gestures can have the biggest impact, even if they come with unintended consequences. Story 2. It was supposed to be a routine day, just another shift as a key holder for a condo building. My job was simple. Let the air conditioning guys into units so they could inspect the systems. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that day, everything changed. It's been years, and I still can't eat wonton soup or stand the smell of a dirty fridge without feeling sick. And I'll never forget the sight of that woman in the bed. The day started like any other. I met the AC guys in the lobby, clipboard in hand, and we began making our way through the building. Most of the units were empty, the owners at work or out running errands. We'd knock, wait, and if there was no answer, I'd use my master key to let the guys in. It was monotonous work, but it paid the bills. By late afternoon, we were down to the last few units. One of them was on the 12th floor, a corner unit with a view of the city. I knocked on the door, waited a few seconds, and when there was no answer, I unlocked it. The moment I opened the door, a foul smell hit me like a punch to the gut. It was sour, almost chemical, like rotten eggs mixed with something far worse. "It's pretty fucking rank in here," I said, holding my breath as I stepped inside. The AC guys followed, their faces twisting in disgust. The kitchen was a mess. Moldy bread on the counter, a sweaty-looking cake on the stove, and an overflowing trash can. But it was the bedroom that stopped me in my tracks. There, on the bed, was a woman. At first glance, I thought she was an older black woman with a bad blonde dye job, hunched over in what looked like a yoga pose. "Sorry, ma'am, I didn't know you were home," I said, my voice cracking with embarrassment. She didn't move. I took a step closer. "Ma'am." One of the AC guys, a burly man named Greg, muttered, "She's fucking dead, dude," and bolted out of the unit. I froze, my eyes fixed on the woman. Her skin was discolored, bruised in places, with patches of mold growing on it. This wasn't a yoga pose. It was the way her body had settled into the bed after death. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, and called 911. The operator spent 2 minutes trying to convince me to check for a pulse, but I couldn't bring myself to touch her. "I'm not a doctor," I said, my voice shaking. "She's gone. Just send someone." The police arrived quickly, along with a coroner. As they worked, I sat in the hallway, trying to process what I'd seen. One of the officers told me the woman was actually a young Caucasian blonde, not the older black woman I'd mistaken her for. Her last diary entry was 10 days old, and there were pill bottles and a last will and testament on the bedside table. It was a tragic, lonely end. The rest of the day was a blur. I went home, showered until the water ran cold, and tried to eat something. I ordered wonton soup, thinking it would be comforting, but the smell made me gag. I couldn't finish it. To this day, I can't eat wonton soup without thinking of that day. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to shake the memory. The smell of a dirty fridge, like the one in the condo, would send me running for fresh air. And my fascination with zombie apocalypses? Gone. The reality of death was far less glamorous than the movies made it seem. Surprisingly, the condo management gave me an Employee of the Month award and a $100 gift certificate. For handling a difficult situation with professionalism, they said. I appreciated the gesture, but it felt hollow. It had been a slow month, after all. A few months later, I got another call for a routine inspection at the same building. My stomach churned as I approached the unit, but this time, the owner was home, a cheerful older man who offered me coffee and cookies. "You're the guy who found the poor woman, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded, and he patted my shoulder. "You did a good thing. She deserved to be found." His words stayed with me. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a responsibility. People trusted us to look after their homes, even in the worst of circumstances. And while I'll never forget that day, it taught me the importance of compassion and the fragility of life. As for the gift certificate, I used it to buy a new pair of work boots. Every time I lace them up, I'm reminded of that day and the woman who deserved better. Story 3. As a firefighter and EMT, I've seen my fair share of tragic and unsettling scenes, but there's one call that will always stay with me. It was mid-July in Arizona, the kind of heat that makes the air feel like a furnace. We got a call to check on a middle-aged man who lived in his van in a parking lot on the outskirts of town. He'd been there for years, never bothering anyone, so the police had let him stay. But now, there was a complaint about a foul odor, and no one had seen him for weeks. We all knew what we were walking into, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found. When we arrived, the van was silent, the windows fogged with condensation. I approached the back door, my stomach already churning. As soon as I opened it, a thick cloud of flies erupted, so dense it was like a wall of black. The stench hit me like a physical blow, rotten, sweet, and nauseating. I stepped back, coughing, and waited for the swarm to clear. When it did, we finally saw inside. The man had been dead for at least 2 weeks. The heat had accelerated decomposition, and the scene was gruesome. But what truly shook me was seeing his cats, 2 of them, still alive, huddled in the corner. They had survived by eating parts of his body. It was a sight that burned itself into my memory, a grim reminder of how quickly life can unravel. We called for backup and began the grim task of securing the scene. The cats were skittish and malnourished, their eyes wide with fear. One of my colleagues managed to coax them out with some food, and we handed them over to animal control. As we worked, I couldn't help but wonder about the man's story. Who was he? How had he ended up living in a van in the middle of nowhere? And how had no one noticed he was gone for so long? A few days later, I found myself thinking about the man and his cats. I decided to visit the animal shelter where they'd been taken. The staff told me they were recovering well, but they were still wary of people. I sat with them for a while, talking softly, trying to earn their trust. It felt like a small way to honor the man's memory, to make sure his cats were cared for. As I left the shelter, I made a decision. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's isolation, how he died alone and unnoticed. I reached out to a local outreach program that worked with homeless individuals, offering to volunteer my time. I wanted to do something to help people like him, to make sure they didn't fall through the cracks. Over the next few months, I became more involved with the program. I met people from all walks of life, each with their own struggles and stories. It was eye-opening and humbling, and it gave me a new perspective on my work as a firefighter and EMT. I realized that while we couldn't save everyone, we could at least try to make a difference, even in small ways. The memory of that day in July still haunts me, but it's also inspired me to do more. I've learned that sometimes the most important part of our job isn't just responding to emergencies. It's reaching out, connecting with people, and making sure they know they're not alone. And while I'll never forget the man in the van, I've found a way to turn that memory into something meaningful, a reminder of why I do what I do. Story 4. I used to volunteer for a wildlife rescue, and one of the calls I'll never forget was from a very elderly woman who had found what she thought was a baby bird. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with a warm smile and led me to her kitchen table, where she had carefully placed the bird under a soft towel. She spoke in a gentle, trembling voice, explaining how she had found it in her garden and wanted to make sure it was safe. "Let me see it," I said, trying to match her gentle tone. She nodded and slowly lifted the towel, revealing a chestnut. Not a baby bird, not even close, just a smooth, shiny chestnut. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. The woman looked at me with hopeful eyes, clearly unaware of the mix-up. "Isn't it precious?" she said, her voice filled with tenderness. I thought it might be hungry, so I tried to give it some breadcrumbs, but it didn't eat anything. I hesitated, not wanting to disappoint her. "Ma'am," I began carefully, "this is actually a chestnut. It's a seed from a tree, not a bird." Her face fell, and for a moment, I felt terrible. But then she chuckled softly, a sound that was both sweet and a little sad. "Oh my," she said, shaking her head. "I must be losing my mind. I could have sworn it was a little bird." She picked up the chestnut and held it in her wrinkled hands, studying it with a wistful expression. "I suppose I just wanted it to be something special." Her words struck a chord with me. I could see the loneliness in her eyes, the longing for connection. "You know," I said, "chestnuts are pretty special in their own way. They grow into big, beautiful trees that provide homes for birds and other animals. Maybe you could plant it in your garden and watch it grow." Her eyes lit up at the idea. "Do you think it would grow?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. I nodded, and she smiled, clutching the chestnut to her chest. Then that's what I'll do. I'll plant it and take care of it. Before I left, I helped her find a spot in her garden where the chestnut could thrive. We dug a small hole together, and she placed the chestnut inside, covering it with soil. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but sincere. You've given me something to look forward to. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her kindness, her loneliness, and her determination to find beauty in something as simple as a chestnut stayed with me. A few weeks later, I decided to check in on her. When I arrived, she was in her garden, watering the spot where we had planted the chestnut. She greeted me with a smile and showed me a tiny green shoot that had emerged from the soil. Look, she said, her voice filled with pride. It's growing. I felt a surge of happiness for her, knowing that she had found a new purpose in nurturing this little tree. Over the next few months, I visited her regularly, watching as the chestnut grew into a small sapling. She named it Charlie and treated it like a member of her family. Her garden became a sanctuary, not just for the tree, but for her as well. She started planting other flowers and vegetables, transforming the space into a vibrant oasis. One day, she told me, I think Charlie saved me as much as I saved him. He's given me something to care for, something to look forward to every day. Her words reminded me of the power of small acts of kindness and the unexpected ways they can change lives. Years later, when I drove past her house, I saw a tall, sturdy chestnut tree standing proudly in her garden. It was a testament to her love and care, a living reminder of the day she mistook a chestnut for a baby bird. And every time I see it, I'm reminded of the elderly woman who taught me that even the smallest things can grow into something beautiful if you nurture them with love. Story 5. It had been a couple of years since my divorce, and life was finally starting to feel normal again. I was in a new relationship with a woman named Sarah, and things were going well. She had just rented a basement apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and I was helping her move in. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were unpacking boxes, laughing, and making plans for how to decorate the place. I was organizing the kitchen, putting utensils and random items into drawers, when I opened what seemed to be the junk drawer. Among the loose batteries, expired coupons, and old takeout menus, I found a small strip of photo booth pictures. I picked it up, curious, and froze when I saw the faces staring back at me. It was my ex-wife, Emily, and her sister, Lisa. They looked young, probably in their early teens. The photo was faded, but their smiles were unmistakable. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. It felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into some kind of alternate reality. Why was this here? How had a photo of my ex-wife ended up in Sarah's new apartment? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them making much sense. I called Sarah over. Hey, is this yours? I asked, holding up the photo strip. She took it and studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing. No, I've never seen this before. Who are they? That's my ex-wife and her sister, I said, still trying to process it. From like 15 years ago. Sarah's eyes widened. Wait, seriously? That's so weird. Did Emily live here or something? Not that I know of, I replied. But she grew up in this town, so maybe she visited someone here? We both stood there, puzzling over it. Sarah went to the same high school as Emily and I, so there was a chance she might have known someone connected to the apartment, but she couldn't recall anything specific. The mystery lingered in the air, making the apartment feel a little less like home. Later that evening, I saw the landlord, a guy named Mark, outside doing some yard work. He was in his late 40s, friendly, and seemed like the kind of guy who took good care of his property. I walked over, the photo strip in hand. Hey, Mark, I said, holding it up. I found this in the kitchen drawer. Any idea who it might belong to? He took the photo and studied it, then nodded. Oh yeah, that's Lisa. She was my last tenant. She moved out about 6 months ago. Lisa? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. As in Emily's sister? Yeah, Emily's sister, he confirmed. Small world, huh? She lived here for a couple of years. Quiet, kept to herself. I didn't realize she was your ex-sister-in-law. I thanked him and went back inside, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. The mystery was solved, but it was still strange to think that Lisa had lived here. I told Sarah what I'd learned, and she laughed. "Well, that explains it," she said. "Guess we're living in Lisa's old place. Maybe she left some other treasures behind." Over the next few days, we found a few more odd items: a mismatched sock, a half-used notebook, and a keychain with a charm that looked like it belonged to a teenager. Each discovery felt like a little piece of the past, a reminder of the lives that had passed through the apartment before us. One evening, as we were unpacking the last of the boxes, Sarah found a letter tucked inside an old cookbook. It was addressed to Lisa, dated a few years ago. She handed it to me, and I hesitated before opening it. It was from Emily, written in her familiar handwriting. The letter was short, just a note catching up on family news and asking how Lisa was doing. It ended with, "I miss you. Let's get together soon." Reading it felt like opening a door to a part of my life I tried to leave behind. I showed it to Sarah, and she put a hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, it's just strange. Seeing her handwriting, thinking about the past. But it's okay. It's just a letter." Sarah smiled. "Well, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." The discovery of the letter sparked a conversation about our pasts, the people we'd loved, the mistakes we'd made, and the lessons we'd learned. It was a reminder that life is full of unexpected connections, and that the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. In the end, the apartment became a symbol of new beginnings for both of us. We painted the walls, hung up our own photos, and made it our own. The photo strip and the letter went into a box in the closet, tucked away but not forgotten. They were reminders of where we'd come from, but they didn't define where we were going. As we settled into our new home, I realized that life is full of these little coincidences, moments that seem random but remind us of the threads that connect us all. And while the past might creep in from time to time, it's up to us to decide how much weight we give it. For me, it was a chance to reflect, to let go, and to move forward, with Sarah, and with a renewed sense of hope for the future. Story 6. Back when I was a door-to-door salesman, I had a string of odd experiences that ranged from mildly strange to downright terrifying. It was a job that required thick skin, quick thinking, and a willingness to face the unexpected. Here's one of the more memorable stories, expanded into a full narrative. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, and I was making my rounds in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My bag was slung over my shoulder, filled with brochures and samples of the cleaning products I was pitching. I'd been at this job for a few months now, and I thought I'd seen it all, until that day. The first stop was at a house with a well-kept lawn and a large backyard shed. A man in his late 50s answered the door, wearing a stained apron and holding a glass of red wine. He introduced himself as Carl and, after a brief exchange, invited me to see his pride and joy. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed him to the shed. Inside, it was like stepping into a miniature winery. Rows of barrels lined the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of fermenting grapes. Carl launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his process, how he sourced the grapes, the importance of temperature control, and the art of aging the wine just right. It was fascinating, and I found myself genuinely interested in his passion project. Unfortunately, he wasn't interested in my cleaning products, but we parted on friendly terms. The next house was a different story. A man in his 40s answered the door, wearing a bathrobe that barely reached his knees. He seemed friendly enough, and even agreed to buy a few items. I stepped outside to print his receipt, and when I returned, he was still in the robe, which, as he reached for the receipt, fell open to reveal far more than I ever wanted to see. "Would you like to stay for coffee?" he asked with a grin. I politely declined and made a hasty exit, vowing to never return to that address. By the time I reached the third house, I was already on edge. The man who answered the door was in his 60s, with a stern expression and a voice that carried an undertone of anger. He invited me in, and I followed him into the front room, unaware of what was about to happen. As soon as I stepped inside, he locked the door and positioned himself between me and the exit. Then he started screaming, "You're right out of school, right? And you think you know fucking everything, but you don't know shit. You're just a naive fucking idiot, and you think you know the world. His face was red, veins bulging in his neck as he berated me. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, unsure whether he was going to escalate to physical violence. The tirade went on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 5 minutes. Finally, he unlocked the door and growled, "God, just leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of there and didn't stop running until I was 2 blocks away. Shaken but determined to finish my shift, I pressed on. The next house was a modest bungalow with a neatly tended garden. A woman in her 70s answered the door, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Oh, a salesman. Come in, dear. I've been waiting for someone like you." Her warmth was a welcome change, and I followed her inside. She led me to her living room, which was filled with antique furniture and framed photos of her family. As I began my pitch, she interrupted me. "Before we get to that, would you like some tea? I just made a fresh pot." I accepted, grateful for the chance to sit down and collect myself. Over tea, she told me stories about her late husband and her grandchildren, and I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. When I finally got around to showing her the products, she bought a few items without hesitation. "You're a good listener," she said as I left. "Don't let this job wear you down." The day ended on a high note, but the encounter with the screaming man lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his outburst than met the eye. A few days later, I mentioned the incident to a coworker who had been in the area longer than I had. His eyes widened. "Oh, that's probably Mr. Thompson," he said. "He's a retired teacher. Rumor has it he had a breakdown after his wife left him. He's been a recluse ever since." Hearing that made me see the situation in a different light. While his behavior was inexcusable, it was clear that he was a man in pain, lashing out at the world. It didn't make the experience any less terrifying, but it gave me a sense of empathy I hadn't felt before. That job taught me a lot about people, their passions, their vulnerabilities, and their capacity for kindness and cruelty. It also taught me to trust my instincts and to always be prepared for the unexpected. Looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons, even if some of the memories still make me shudder. Story 7. I've been in the hardwood flooring business for over 2 decades, and in that time, I've seen my fair share of messy basements. People tend to use them as dumping grounds for old furniture, boxes of forgotten junk, and, unfortunately, sometimes much worse. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I walked into a basement that was literally covered in dog shit. It's a memory that still makes me gag, even 15 years later. The job was a standard refinishing project for a small house in a quiet neighborhood. The homeowners were an older couple who seemed nice enough when I arrived. I explained that I needed to access the breaker box in the basement to hook up my big sanding machine. They waved me off with a casual, "Do what you need to do. Do you need us to show you where it is?" I assured them I could find it on my own. I'd been in enough basements to know the drill. I opened the basement door and flipped on the light. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mix of ammonia and decay. I took a cautious step down the stairs, and that's when I saw it. The floor was covered in dog shit. Not just a little, but years' worth of it. There were old, dried-out piles, fresh ones, and everything in between. It was like a minefield of filth. I froze, my boots hovering inches above the mess. My mind raced. How could anyone live like this? I yelled up to one of my guys, "Bring me a hammer and nails. And hurry." He came down, took one look, and gagged. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I was too busy trying not to vomit. We nailed my power cable to the wall, making sure it didn't touch the floor. I worked as quickly as I could, desperate to get out of that basement. The entire time, the smell clung to me, seeping into my clothes and my skin. When I finally emerged, the homeowners were sitting in the living room, completely unfazed. They didn't say a word about the state of their basement, didn't even acknowledge it. I wanted to scream at them, to demand how they could let their dogs live in such squalor. But I bit my tongue. It was a $400 job, and I needed the money. As we worked, I noticed their dogs roaming the house. They were friendly enough, but every time I petted one, my hands smelled like shit. It was disgusting. I kept washing my hands, but the stench lingered. By the end of the day, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I couldn't wait to get home and scrub myself clean. That job stayed with me long after it was over. I'd seen bad basements before, but nothing like that. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of how some people live and the conditions they subject their pets to. I've walked off jobs since then, but back then, I didn't have the luxury. I was a different man. Younger, more desperate, and less willing to confront people about their choices. Years later, I got another call for a refinishing job. The homeowner was a single mother with 2 kids and a dog. When I asked about the basement, she hesitated. "It's a bit of a mess," she admitted, "but I can clean it up before you get here." I appreciated her honesty and told her not to worry. I'd seen worse. When I arrived, the basement was cluttered but clean. There were toys scattered around, a few boxes of old clothes, but no filth. I breathed a sigh of relief and got to work. The homeowner apologized for the mess, but I reassured her. "This is nothing," I said. "You should see some of the basements I've been in." She laughed, and the tension eased. As we talked, I learned that she'd been through a tough divorce and was struggling to keep up with everything. I felt for her. Life can be hard, and sometimes it's all we can do to keep our heads above water. By the end of the job, she was thanking me for being so understanding. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." That job reminded me why I do what I do. It's not just about laying floors. It's about helping people, even in small ways. And it's about being the kind of person who can walk into a messy basement and still treat the homeowner with respect. Because at the end of the day, everyone has a story, and sometimes all they need is a little compassion. As for that first basement, the one covered in dog shit, it's a memory I'll never forget. It changed me, made me more aware of the conditions some animals live in and more willing to speak up when I see something wrong. I'm a different man now, and if I walked into that situation today, I wouldn't hesitate to take those dogs away. Because no one, human or animal, deserves to live like that. Story 8. When I was young, I worked in fire restoration, a job that exposed me to the raw, unfiltered aftermath of disaster. We cleaned up everything: soot, water damage, and the personal belongings people left behind. It was a job that required a strong stomach and an even stronger sense of professionalism. But there were moments that tested both, like the time I had to clean a fancy chair that had been home to a rotting corpse for weeks. It's a story that still haunts me, even decades later. The call came in for a house where the owner had passed away and hadn't been discovered for weeks. The neighbors had noticed the smell and called the authorities. By the time we arrived, the body had been removed, but the damage and the odor remained. The house was filled with expensive furniture, including a high-end chair that had been directly under the body. The insurance company wanted us to try to clean it, but I knew it was a lost cause before we even started. The chair was upholstered in a rich, dark fabric, now stained and reeking of decay. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of rot and chemicals that clung to the air. My team and I suited up in protective gear, but nothing could fully prepare us for what we were about to face. We started by photographing the chair for the insurance claim, documenting every stain and tear. As we worked, I couldn't stop thinking about the person who had died there. It was a sobering reminder of how fragile life is and how quickly things can change. We tried every cleaning method we knew: steam, solvents, enzymes, but the stains wouldn't budge, and the smell lingered no matter what we did. It was clear the chair was beyond saving, but we had to prove it to the insurance company. After hours of futile effort, we finally called it. We documented our findings and submitted the report, along with the photos. The insurance adjuster came to inspect the chair and agreed it was a total loss. It was a small victory, but it didn't make the job any easier. The experience stayed with me, a grim reminder of the darker side of my work. But it also taught me the importance of empathy and respect. The homeowner's family was devastated, and they trusted us to handle their loved ones' belongings with care, even in the most difficult circumstances. A few weeks later, I got another call, a house fire this time. When I arrived, the homeowner, a middle-aged man, greeted me at the door. He looked embarrassed as he explained, "There are some personal items in the house. I just wanted to warn you." I nodded, used to this kind of disclosure. "Don't worry," I said. "We've seen it all." As we cleaned, I found myself sifting through drawers filled with Polaroid nudes, dildos, and other intimate items. It was awkward, but I reminded myself it was part of the job. The man hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable, so I tried to lighten the mood. "We'll take care of everything," I assured him. "Your secrets are safe with us." He laughed nervously, and the tension eased. By the end of the job, he was joking about it, even offering to buy us lunch as a thank you. It was a stark contrast to the grimness of the rotting corpse chair, but it reminded me that every job had its own challenges. Years later, I still think about those experiences. They were extreme, yes, but they also shaped the way I approached my work. Whether it was cleaning up after a fire or dealing with the aftermath of death, I learned to treat every situation with professionalism and compassion. People trusted us with their homes, their belongings, and their memories, and that was a responsibility I never took lightly. And as for the chair, it was eventually replaced, but the memory of it, and the lessons it taught me, stayed with me forever. Story 9. I work in insurance restoration, dealing with houses that have caught fire, flooded, or suffered other disasters. It's a job that exposes you to a lot of strange and heartbreaking situations, but nothing could have prepared me for the day I stumbled upon a freezer full of cats. It's a story that still makes me shudder when I think about it. The call came in for a house fire. The homeowner, a woman in her 60s, had escaped unharmed, but the damage was extensive. The fire had started in the kitchen and spread quickly, leaving much of the house charred and uninhabitable. My team and I were tasked with assessing the damage and beginning the restoration process. When we arrived, the woman was standing in the driveway, clutching a photo album. She seemed calm but distant, as if her mind were somewhere else. I introduced myself and asked if there was anything specific she wanted us to focus on. She shook her head. "Just do what you need to do," she said quietly. We started in the garage, which had sustained minimal damage. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and everything was covered in a fine layer of soot. That's when I noticed the deep freezer in the corner. It was an old model, the kind with a heavy lid and a latch. The power had been out for a week, and I knew whatever was inside would be in rough shape. I opened the freezer, and the smell hit me like a truck. It was a mix of rot, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. I peered inside and froze. The freezer was packed with plastic bags, each one containing a cat. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, stacked neatly like frozen groceries. My stomach turned, and I quickly closed the lid. I stepped outside to catch my breath, trying to process what I'd just seen. When I returned, the woman was standing by the garage door, watching me. "You found them, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with sadness. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "They're my babies," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Every cat I've ever had since the 80s is in there. I couldn't bear to part with them, so I kept them close." She explained how she'd carefully preserved each one, wrapping them in plastic and storing them in the freezer. It was her way of honoring their memory. I didn't know how to respond. It was bizarre, yes, but also deeply personal. I could see how much it meant to her, how much she loved those cats. I decided to handle the situation as delicately as possible. "We'll need to remove the freezer," I said gently, "but we can make sure everything is handled with care." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "They were my family." Over the next few days, we worked on the house, cleaning and repairing the damage. The freezer was carefully removed and disposed of, following proper protocols. The woman stayed with a neighbor, but she visited the house often, watching us work and sharing stories about her cats. Each one had a name and a personality, and she remembered them all vividly. One afternoon, she brought me a photo album filled with pictures of her cats. "I wanted you to see them as they were," she said, flipping through the pages. There were snapshots of cats lounging in the sun, playing with toys, and curled up in her lap. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before. A woman who had poured her love into her pets and found solace in their memory. When the restoration was complete, she thanked me for treating her and her cats with respect. "Not everyone would have understood," she said, "but you did." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. That job stayed with me long after it was over. It was a reminder that everyone has a story, even if it's one we might not understand at first. And sometimes, the best thing we can do is listen and show compassion, no matter how strange the situation might seem. As for the freezer full of cats, it's a memory I'll never forget. A bizarre, unsettling, and ultimately human story about love, loss, and the lengths we go to hold on to what matters most. Story 10. I used to install Dish Network for a living, and over the years, I've had my share of strange and memorable encounters. But one job stands out above the rest. The day I installed a system for an elderly lady who believed her sister's TV always showed the same thing as hers. It started out as a routine installation, but by the time I left, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. The call came in as a standard 2-TV installation order. When I arrived at the house, the woman greeted me warmly. She was in her late 70s, with a kind smile and a slightly nervous energy. As I began setting up the first TV, she mentioned, "My sister's TV always shows the same thing as mine. I hope that's not a problem." I assumed she meant her sister lived nearby and had a similar setup, so I assured her it wouldn't be an issue. The installation went smoothly. I mounted the TVs, connected the receivers, and made sure everything was working perfectly. When it came time to demonstrate the system, I sat down with her in the living room and started flipping through channels. That's when things took a turn. She pointed to a full-length mirror on the wall and said, "See? Her TV is still showing the same thing as mine." I froze, staring at the mirror. It wasn't a TV. It was just a mirror, reflecting the same image as the screen in front of us. I tried to explain, "Ma'am, that's a mirror. It's reflecting what's on your TV." She shook her head firmly. "No, that's my sister's TV. She's always watching the same thing as me." Her tone was so matter-of-fact that it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone else there, but we were alone. I finished the demonstration as quickly as I could, my mind racing. She seemed completely convinced that the mirror was a TV, and I didn't know how to handle it. As I packed up my tools, she thanked me and said, "My sister will be so happy with the new system." I forced a smile and nodded, eager to get out of there. Back in my truck, I sat for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I made a note on her account, detailing the incident in case she called in with further complaints. I didn't want the next technician to walk into that situation unprepared. A few days later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to do a little digging and reached out to a colleague who had worked in the area longer than I had. When I mentioned the address, his face turned serious. "That house? Yeah, I've heard stories about it. The lady who lives there lost her twin sister years ago. They were inseparable, and she's never been the same since." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, the mirror TV made a heartbreaking kind of sense. She wasn't just confused. She was clinging to a memory, a way to keep her sister close. I felt a mix of sadness and guilt for how I'd reacted. A week later, I found myself driving back to her house. I didn't have a work reason to be there, but I felt compelled to check on her. When she opened the door, she smiled and invited me in. "I was just watching my sister's favorite show," she said, gesturing to the mirror. This time, I didn't correct her. Instead, I sat down with her and watched the reflection of the TV with her. We talked for a while, and she told me stories about her sister. How they used to watch TV together, how they'd laugh at the same jokes, how they finished each other's sentences. It was clear how much she missed her. Before I left, I made sure her system was working perfectly and promised to stop by again. Over the next few months, I visited her regularly, not as a technician but as a friend. We'd watch TV together, and she'd talk about her sister as if she were still there. I didn't have the heart to tell her otherwise. Sometimes, the line between reality and memory blurs, and all we can do is meet people where they are. That job changed me. It taught me that sometimes, the strangest situations have the most human explanations. And sometimes, the best thing we can do is listen, even if we don't fully understand. Story 11. A few years ago, I was volunteering with the city council, helping people clean their houses after our neighborhood had been flooded. One of the houses belonged to a Chinese couple who ran the local convenience store. They asked our crew to help remove water-damaged carpet from the ground floor rooms so it could be thrown away. As we started pulling up the carpet, We noticed it ran in one piece under a closed door and into a locked room. I turned to the lady of the house and asked, "Should we cut it off at the door, or would you like us to remove the carpet in that room too?" She hesitated and said, "I'll check with my husband. That's his special room." That phrase, special room, sent a ripple of curiosity through our crew. What could a middle-aged Chinese man who owned a convenience store possibly keep in his special room? We exchanged puzzled glances, trying to keep our imaginations in check. Eventually, the wife returned with a set of keys and unlocked the door. We all crowded around as she pushed it open, and what we saw left us speechless. The room was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The carpet ran up the walls, giving it a cozy, almost surreal feel. A mirror ball hung from the ceiling, and at one end of the room was a small stage with a professional-looking PA sound system and a projector. In the corner sat the fanciest karaoke machine I'd ever laid eyes on. It was clear this wasn't just a room. It was a sanctuary. The wife smiled at our stunned expressions. "My husband loves music," she explained. "This is where he sings after a long day at the store. It's his way of relaxing." I nodded, suddenly understanding why the room was so special. We got to work carefully removing the damaged carpet, making sure not to disturb any of the equipment. As we worked, the wife shared more about her husband's passion. "He's been singing since he was a boy in China," she said. "When we moved here, he missed the karaoke culture back home, so he created this space. Sometimes, he even invites friends over for karaoke nights." Her words stayed with me as we finished the job. There was something deeply moving about the idea of this man carving out a space for himself to connect with his roots and express his love for music. It was a reminder that even in the midst of hardship, people find ways to hold on to what brings them joy. A few days later, we returned to help with the final cleanup. When we arrived, Mr. Chun, the husband, was waiting for us. He greeted us with a warm smile and said, "Thank you for your hard work. I'd like to show you something." He led us to the now-clean special room. The new carpet looked great, and the room seemed to glow with a renewed energy. Mr. Chen walked over to the karaoke machine and turned it on. "I'd like to sing a song for you, as a thank you," he said. We gathered around as he began to sing a traditional Chinese ballad. His voice was powerful and filled with emotion, and I felt a lump form in my throat. It wasn't just a song. It was a gift, a piece of his heart. When he finished, we all clapped, and I could see the pride in his eyes. That moment stayed with me long after we left the house. It wasn't just about the cleanup or the karaoke machine. It was about the resilience and creativity of the human spirit. Mr. Chin's special room was a testament to the power of music and the importance of holding on to the things that make us who we are. As I drove away, I couldn't help but smile, feeling grateful to have been a part of something so meaningful. Story 12. I used to work in pest control, and over the years, I've seen some strange things in people's homes. But nothing quite prepared me for the day I encountered the Cheeto Puff bathroom bowl. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was assigned to a routine job at a modest suburban house. The homeowners had reported a roach problem, and my task was to inspect the property and set up bait stations. I arrived at the house and was greeted by a middle-aged woman named Linda. She seemed friendly but a little frazzled, as if the roach situation had been weighing on her. "Thank you for coming," she said, ushering me inside. "They're mostly in the kitchen and bathroom, but I've seen them in the living room too." I started in the kitchen, setting up bait stations in the cabinets and along the baseboards. The roaches weren't too bad, just a few scurrying away when I moved things around. I moved on to the living room, where I found a few more hiding behind the TV stand. Everything was going smoothly until I made my way to the bathroom. The bathroom was small but tidy, with a floral shower curtain and a few decorative touches. As I stepped inside, my eyes landed on a decorative bowl sitting on top of the toilet tank. At first glance, it looked like a normal bathroom accessory, maybe holding extra toilet paper or washcloths. But when I got closer, I realized it was filled to the brim with white cheddar Cheeto Puffs. I blinked, wondering if I was seeing things correctly. Nope, those were definitely Cheeto Puffs. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Were they for snacking? A quirky decoration? I couldn't decide which was weirder. I finished setting up the bait stations in the bathroom, trying not to disturb the bowl, and then returned to the kitchen where Linda was waiting. Everything's set up, I told her. I'll need to come back in a couple of weeks to check on the bait and see how things are progressing. She nodded, looking relieved. Thank you so much. I've been so stressed about this. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to ask. By the way, I couldn't help but notice the bowl in the bathroom. Is that Cheeto Puffs? Linda laughed, a little embarrassed. Oh, that. Yeah, it's kind of a long story. My husband, Greg, has this thing about snacks. He likes to have them within arm's reach at all times. He started keeping a bowl of Cheeto Puffs in the bathroom so he could snack while he, takes his time in there. It's become a bit of a running joke in our house. I chuckled, relieved to have an explanation. That's one way to do it, I said. Whatever works, I guess. A couple of weeks later, I returned to check on the bait stations. The roach situation had improved significantly, and Linda seemed much more relaxed. As I was wrapping up, Greg came home from work. He was a burly guy with a friendly smile and a booming laugh. Linda introduced us, and I mentioned the Cheeto Puff Bowl. Greg grinned. Ah, you've discovered my secret stash, he said. Gotta have my snacks, man. Life's too short to go without Cheeto Puffs. We all laughed, and I finished up my work, feeling like I'd gotten a little glimpse into their quirky but endearing household. As I drove away, I couldn't help but smile. Pest control might not be the most glamorous job, but it sure did come with its share of interesting stories. And the Cheeto Puff bathroom bowl was definitely one for the books. Story 13. I used to work as an in-home therapist, visiting families to provide support and counseling. Over the years, I'd seen a lot. Homes in disarray, families struggling with mental health issues, and situations that tested my ability to stay professional. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I walked into the home of a mother with mild intellectual disabilities, MR, and her 3 young children. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where you'd expect to see kids riding bikes and families grilling in their backyards. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with the smell of urine and decay. The living room was a disaster. Chairs had been smashed to pieces, the couch was shredded with what looked like knife marks, and the walls were covered in scribbles and stains. It was as if a tornado had ripped through the house, leaving chaos in its wake. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I greeted the mother, who introduced herself as Carol. She was in her late 30s, with a kind but distant smile. Her 3 kids, ages 5, 7, and 9, peeked out from behind her, their faces smudged with dirt. They looked wary but curious, like they weren't used to visitors. "Hi, Carol," I said, trying to sound calm and reassuring. "I'm here to see how things are going and to offer some support. Can we talk for a bit?" She nodded and led me further into the house. The kitchen was even worse than the living room. The cabinets had been completely destroyed, their doors hanging off the hinges, and the countertops were cluttered with empty cans, rotting food, and jars of urine. There were dozens of them, lined up like some kind of macabre collection. I tried not to react, but my stomach churned. "Carol," I said carefully, "is the plumbing working here? Do you have running water?" She nodded again and turned on the kitchen faucet to show me. The water ran clear, but that only deepened the mystery. "Do the kids have any issues with using the bathroom?" I asked, hoping for an explanation. "No," Carol said simply, her smile never wavering. "They're fine." I glanced at the jars of urine, then back at her. "Can you tell me about these jars? Why are they here?" She just smiled and looked away, refusing to answer. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. This wasn't just a messy house. This was a situation that put the kids at risk. I knew I had to act. I spent the next hour talking to Carol and the kids, trying to assess the situation. The children were quiet, but seemed physically unharmed. They didn't mention the state of the house or the jars, as if it were all normal to them. Carol was cooperative but evasive, deflecting any questions about the destruction or the urine. Before I left, I made sure to document everything. The condition of the house, the jars, the children's behavior. As soon as I got back to my car, I called Child Protective Services, CPS, to report what I'd seen. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was the right one. The kids deserved a safe and healthy environment, and Carol needed help that I couldn't provide on my own. A few days later, I followed up with CPS to check on the family. They had opened a case and assigned a social worker to investigate. The social worker visited the home and confirmed everything I'd reported. They also discovered that Carol had been struggling with untreated mental health issues, which had led to the bizarre and unsafe living conditions. Over the next few weeks, CPS worked with Carol to create a plan for improving the home and ensuring the kids' safety. They connected her with mental health services and provided resources for parenting support. The children were temporarily placed with a relative while the house was cleaned and repaired. I continued to visit the family as part of my job, and over time, I saw small but meaningful changes. Carol began attending therapy and seemed more engaged in caring for her kids. The house was slowly transformed into a livable space, and the jars of urine were gone. The children started to open up, their wary expressions replaced by smiles and laughter. It was a long and difficult process, but eventually, the family was reunited in a safer, healthier home. Carol still had challenges to face, but she was making progress, and the kids were thriving. It was a reminder of why I did this work, to help families in crisis and to make a difference, even in the most difficult situations. That house, with its destroyed furniture and jars of urine, had been a symbol of chaos and neglect. But through intervention and support, it became a symbol of hope and resilience. And for me, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of speaking up and taking action when something isn't right. Story 14. I've been a construction inspector for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange homes. But nothing could have prepared me for the house on Maplewood Drive. It was a sprawling, old property that had been on the market for years before a young couple finally bought it with plans to renovate. My job was to inspect the structure and assess what needed to be done before they could start the project. From the outside, the house looked like any other aging mansion. Ivy creeping up the brick walls, a sagging roof, and a front porch that had seen better days. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew this place was different. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the decor was straight out of a 1970s hunting lodge. The basement, in particular, was a trip back in time. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, the floors were Spanish tile, and the walls were adorned with dozens of mounted animal heads, deer, elk, even a bear. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to the previous owner's eccentric taste. I was down in the basement, trying to understand the relationship between the foundation and the main floor, when I noticed something odd. One of the bookcases seemed slightly off, like it wasn't flush with the wall. I gave it a closer look and realized it was a hidden door. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open, revealing a small room, maybe 80 square feet. The room was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The ceiling had a single recessed fluorescent light fixture, covered by a heavy steel grating. The floor and walls were lined with sheet vinyl, and in the center of the room was a single metal chair, positioned directly over a floor drain. The air was cold, and the silence was deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped back, my heart racing. Something about that room felt wrong, deeply wrong. I didn't even finish my inspection. I just took a few photos, closed the hidden door, and got out of there as fast as I could. When I met with the new owners later that day, I showed them the photos and told them what I'd found. They were visibly shaken. "What do you think it was?" the wife asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I wouldn't touch that room until you've had someone look into it. Maybe a historian or a private investigator." The couple decided to halt the renovation and called in a private investigator to look into the house's history. What they discovered was chilling. The house had been owned by a man named Walter Hargrove, a wealthy recluse who had died under mysterious circumstances in the 1980s. Hargrove was rumored to have been involved in illegal activities, including smuggling and black market trading, but nothing had ever been proven. The investigator also found records suggesting that Hargrove had been questioned in connection with several disappearances in the area, though no charges were ever filed. The couple was horrified. They decided to abandon the renovation entirely and instead tore the house down. They built a new home on the property, but even that didn't erase the unease that lingered. The site seemed to carry a dark energy, and the neighbors whispered about strange occurrences, lights flickering, shadows moving in the windows of the new house, and an inexplicable feeling of dread that seemed to hang over the property. As for me, I couldn't shake the memory of that room. I still drive by the site occasionally, and every time, I feel that same chill I felt when I first stepped into the basement. I don't know what happened in that house, but I'm certain of one thing. Some places are better left in the past, and some doors are better left closed.